When the opportune moment to strike arrives, the blow must fall. For the next instant it may be futile. Not only moments, but hours of delay occurred. I am criticizing officers for the lack of complete cooperation, not for unavoidable delays. I am simply stating facts which must necessarily affect the verdict of history. Had all the commands designated by General Lee cooperated by a simultaneous assault, thus preventing Meade from grouping his troops around his centre, and had the onset upon that centre occurred in the early morning, as intended by Lee, it requires no partiality to see that this great commander's object would have been assuredly achieved. That the plan involved hazard is undoubtedly true. All battles between such troops as confronted each other at Gettysburg are hazardous and uncertain. If the commanders of the Confederate and Union armies had waited for opportunities free of hazard and uncertainty, no great battle would have been fought and the war never would have ended. The question which history will ask is this: was General Lee justified in expecting success? The answer will be that, with his experience in meeting the same Union army at Fredericksburg, at the Second Manassas, in the 7 days' battles around Richmond, and at Chancellorsville, with an army behind him which he believed well nigh invincible, and which army believed its commander well nigh infallible, with a victory for his troops on the first day at Gettysburg, the completeness of which had been spoiled only by an untimely and fatal halt, with the second day's battle ending with alternate successes and indecisive results, and with the expectation of prompt action and vigorous united cooperation, he was abundantly justified in confidently expecting success. Wellington at Waterloo and Meade at Gettysburg each held the Highlands against his antagonist. Wellington on Mont Saint-Jean and Meade on Cemetery Ridge had the bird's-eye view of the forces of attack. The English batteries on the plateau and the Union batteries on Cemetery Heights commanded alike the intervening undulations across which the charging columns must advance. Behind Mont Saint-Jean, to conceal Wellington's movements from Napoleon's eye, were the woodlands of Soignies. Behind Cemetery Ridge, to conceal Meade's movements from the field glasses of Lee, was a sharp declivity, a protecting and helpful depression. As the French under Napoleon at Waterloo, so the Confederates under Lee at Gettysburg held the weaker position. In both cases, the assailants sought to expel their opponents from the stronger lines. I might add another resemblance in the results which followed. Waterloo decreed the destiny of France, of England, of Europe. Gettysburg, not so directly or immediately, but practically, decided the fate of the Confederacy. There were points of vast divergence. The armies which met at Waterloo were practically equal. This was not true of the armies that met at Gettysburg. Napoleon's artillery far exceeded that of Wellington. Lee's was far inferior to Meade's, in the metal from which the guns were moulded, as well as in number. Waterloo was a rout, Gettysburg a repulse. Napoleon, in the ensuing panic, was a deserted fugitive. Lee rode amidst his broken lines, calmly majestic, the idol of his followers. With no trace of sympathy for Napoleon's selfish aims, with righteous condemnation of his vaulting ambition, one cannot fail to realize the profound pathos of his position on that dismal night of wildest panic and lonely flight. Abandoned by fortune, deserted by his army, discrowned and doomed, he is described by Hugo as having not an organized company to comfort him, not even his faithful old guard to rally around him. In Lee's army there was neither panic nor precipitate retreat. There was no desertion of the great commander. Around him still stood his heroic legions, with confidence in him unshaken, love for him unabated, ready to follow his lead and to fight under his orders to the last extremity. General Meade evidently, perhaps naturally, expected far greater confusion and disorganization in Lee's army, from the terrific repulse to which it had been subjected. He wisely threw his cavalry upon Lee's flank in order to sweep down upon the rear and cut to pieces or capture the fragments of Southern infantry in case of general retreat or demoralization. As the Union bugles sounded the charge, however, for the gallant horsemen under Farnsworth, Lee's right was ready to receive them. Proudly they rode, but promptly were they repulsed. Many saddles were emptied by Confederate bullets. The intrepid commander, General Farnsworth himself, lost his life in the charge. On the other flank, and with similar design, Lee had placed Stuart with his dashing Confederate riders. Stuart was to attack when Lee's infantry had pierced Meade's centre, and when the Union army was cut in twain and in rapid retreat. This occasion never came to Stuart, but he found all the opportunity he could reasonably desire for the exercise of his men and horses in a furious combat with Gregg's 5,000 Union troopers. The introduction of gunpowder and bullets and of long-range repeating rifles has, in modern warfare, greatly lessened the effectiveness of cavalry in general battle with infantry, and deprived that great arm of the service of the terror which its charges once inspired. In wars of the early centuries, the swift horseman rode down the comparatively helpless infantry and trampled its ranks under the horses' feet. For ages after the dismemberment of the Roman Empire, it was the vast bodies of cavalry that checked and changed the currents of battles and settled the fate of armies and empires. This is not true, now can never be true again, but a cavalry charge, met by a countercharge of cavalry, is still, perhaps, the most terrible spectacle witnessed in war. If the reader has never seen such a charge, he can form little conception of its awe-inspiring fury. Imagine yourself looking down from Gettysburg's heights upon the open, wide-spreading plain below, where 5,000 horses are marshalled in battle line. Standing beside them are 5,000 riders, armed, booted and spurred and ready to mount. The bugles sound the mount, and instantly 5,000 plumes rise above the horses as the riders spring into their saddles. In front of the respective squadrons, the daring leaders take their places. The fluttering pennants or streaming guidons, 10 to each regiment, mark the left of the companies. On the opposite slope of the same plain are 5,000 hostile horsemen clad in different uniforms, ready to meet these in countercharge. Under those 10,000 horses are their hoofs, iron-shod and pitiless, beneath whose furious tread the plain is soon to quiver. Again on each slope of the open field the bugles sound. 10,000 sabres leap from scabbards and glisten in the sun. The trained horses chafe their restraining bits, and, as the bugle notes sound the charge, their nostrils dilate and their flanks swell in sympathetic impulse with the dashing riders. "Forward!" shouts the commander. Down the lines and through the columns in quick succession ring the echoing commands. "Forward! Forward!" As this order thrills through eager ears, sabres flash and spurs are planted in palpitating flanks. The madly flying horses thunder across the trembling field, filling the air with clouds of dust and whizzing pebbles. Their iron-rimmed hoofs in remorseless tread crush the stones to powder and crash through the flesh and bones of hapless riders who chance to fall. As front against front these furious riders plunge, their sweeping sabres slashing edge against edge, cutting a way through opposing ranks, gashing faces, breaking arms, and splitting heads, it is a scene of wildest war, a whirling tempest of battle, short-lived but terrible. Swell's corps, of which my command was a part, was the last to leave Gettysburg, and the only corps of either army, I believe, that forded the Potomac. Reaching this river, we found it for the time an impassable barrier against our further progress southward. The pontoons had been destroyed. The river was deep and muddy, swollen and swift. We were leaving Pennsylvania and the full granaries that had fed us. Pennsylvania was our Egypt, whither we had gone to buy corn. We regretted leaving, although we had found far less favour with the authorities of this modern Egypt than had Joseph and his brethren with the rulers of the ancient land of abundance. The fording of the Potomac in the dim starlight of that 13th of July night and early morning of the 14th was a spectacular phase of war so quaint and impressive as to leave itself lastingly daguerreotyped on the memory. To the giants in the army the passage was comparatively easy, but the short-legged soldiers were a source of anxiety to the officers and of constant amusement to their long-legged comrades. With their knapsacks high up on their shoulders, their cartridge boxes above the knapsacks, and their guns lifted still higher to keep them dry, these little heroes of the army battled with the current from shore to shore. borne down below the line of march by the swiftly rolling water, slipping and sliding in the mud and slime, and stumbling over the boulders at the bottom, the marvel is that none were drowned. The irrepressible spirit for fun-making, for jests and good-natured jibes, was not wanting to add to the grotesque character of the passage. Let the reader imagine himself, if he can, struggling to hold his feet under him, with the water up to his armpits, and some tall, stalwart man just behind him shouting, "Pull ahead, Johnny! General Meade will help you along directly by turning loose a battery of parrot guns on you." Or another, in his front, calling to him, "Run here, little boy, and get on my back, and I'll carry you over safely." Or still another, with mock solemnity, proposing to change the name of the corps to Lee's Waders, and this answered by a counter-proposition to petition the Secretary of War to imitate old Frederick the Great and organise a corps of 6-footers to do this sort of work for the whole army. Or still another offering. "Congratulations on this opportunity for being washed. The first we have had, boys, for weeks, and General Lee knows we need it." Most of our wounded and our blue-coated comrades who accompanied us as prisoners were shown greater consideration. They were ferried across in boats. The only serious casualty connected with this dangerous crossing occurred at the point least expected. From the pontoon bridge, which had been repaired, and which was regarded as not only the most comfortable, but by far the safest method of transit, the horses and a wagon loaded with sick and wounded were plunged into the river. By well-directed effort they were rescued, not one of the men, I believe, being lost. General Meade was deliberate in his pursuit, if not considerate in his treatment of us. He had induced us to change our minds. Instead of visiting Philadelphia on this trip, he had persuaded us to return toward Richmond. He doubtless thought that the last day's fight at Gettysburg was fairly good work for one campaign, and that if he attempted to drive us more rapidly from Pennsylvania, the experiment might prove expensive. As previously intimated, he was probably correct in this opinion. Had he left his strong position while Lee stood waiting for him to come out on the 4th of July at Gettysburg and to assume the offensive, the chances are at least even that his assault would have been repelled and might have led to a Union disaster. One of the wisest adages in war is to avoid doing what your antagonist desires, and it is beyond dispute that, from General Lee down through all the grades, even to the heroic privates in the ranks, there was a readiness, if not a desire, to meet General Meade should he advance upon us. Meade's policy after the Confederate repulse at Gettysburg did not differ materially from that of Lee after the Union repulse at Fredericksburg. General Halleck, as he surveyed the situation from Washington, did not like General Meade's deliberation and pelted him with telegrams extremely nettling to that proud soldier's sensibilities. In the citadel of the War Office at Washington, General Halleck could scarcely catch so clear a view of the situation as could General Meade from the bloody and shivered rocks of the Round Tops. No one doubts General Halleck's ability or verbal impetuosity. To Southern apprehension, however, there was far more serious work to be expected from the silent Grant and the undemonstrative Meade than from the explosive Halleck or fulminating Pope. It is one of the curious coincidences of the war that the results at Gettysburg furnished the occasion for the tender of resignation by each of the commanders-in-chief. Lee offered to resign because he had not satisfied himself, Meade because he had not satisfied his government. Lee feared discontent among his people. Meade found it with General Halleck. Relief from command was denied to Lee. It was granted at last to Meade. It would have been a fatal mistake, a blunder, to have accepted General Lee's resignation. There was no other man who could have filled his place in the confidence, veneration, and love of his army. His relief from command in Virginia would have brought greater dissatisfaction, if not greater disaster, than did the removal from command of General Joseph E. Johnston in Georgia. The Continental Congress might as safely have dispensed with the services of Washington as could the Confederacy with those of Lee. Looking back now over the records of that titanic sectional struggle in the light of Lee's repeated successes prior to the Gettysburg Battle, and of his prolonged resistance in 1864–65, with depleted ranks and exhausted resources, how strangely sounds the story of his self-abnegation and desire to turn over his army to some, younger and abler man. How beautiful and deeply sincere the words, coming from his saddened heart, in which he characterized his devoted followers in that official letter tendering his resignation. Speaking of the new commander, whose selection he was anxious should at once be made, he said, "I know he will have as gallant and brave an army as ever existed to second his efforts, and it will be the happiest day of my life to see at its head a worthy leader, one who can accomplish more than I can hope to perform, and all that I have wished." He urged with characteristic earnestness, as his reason for asking the selection of another commander, "the desire to serve my country, and to do all in my power to ensure the success of her righteous cause." He had no grievances to ventilate, no scapegoat to bear the burden of his responsibilities, no puerile repinings at the fickleness of fortune, no complaints to lodge against the authorities above him for the paucity of the resources they were able to provide. Of himself, and of himself only, did he complain, and he was the only man in his army who would have made such complaint. General Lee might criticize himself, but criticisms of him by any other officer would have been answered by an indignant and crushing rebuke from the whole Confederate Army. The nearest approach he made to fault-finding was his statement that his own sight was not perfect, and that he was so dull that in attempting to use the eyes of others, he found himself often misled. To General Lee's request to be relieved, and to have an abler man placed in his position, Mr. Davis very pointedly and truthfully replied that to request him to find someone more fit for command, or who possessed more of the confidence of the army, or of the reflecting men of the country, is to demand an impossibility. Chapter 12. Vicksburg and Helena. If called upon to select, in the 4 years of war from April 1861 to April 1865, 4 consecutive days into which were crowded events more momentous and decisive than occurred in any other like period, I should name the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th of July, 1863. During the first 3, we were engaged at Gettysburg in a struggle which might decide the fate of the federal capital, of Baltimore, and possibly of Philadelphia, if not of the Union itself. On the 4th, General Grant received the surrender at Vicksburg of 35,000 Confederates under General Pemberton. There were other days which will always be conspicuous in the records of that war, but I do not believe that any other 4 days, consecutive or isolated, so directly and decidedly dashed the hopes of the Southern people. The Double disaster to our arms, the Gettysburg failure and the fall of Vicksburg, occurring at distant points and almost simultaneously, was a blow heavy enough to have effectually dispirited any army that was ever marshalled. It is, however, a remarkable fact that the morale of the Confederate Army was not affected, at least was not perceptibly lowered by it. The men endured increasing privations with the same cheerfulness, and fought with the same constancy and courage after those events as they did before. In proof, I need only summon as witnesses the fields of Chickamauga, Resaca, Atlanta, and Jonesboro in Georgia, Franklin in Tennessee, Monocacy in Maryland, and the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, Bermuda Hundred, and Petersburg in Virginia. To Southern thought, this wonderfully persistent courage of the Southern troops is easily understood on the theory that the independence of the South was as consecrated a cause as any for which freemen ever fought. But it is probably true that such steadfastness and constancy under such appalling conditions will remain to analytical writers of later times one of the unsolved mysteries of that marvellous era of internecine strife. The capture by General Grant of Pemberton and his men at Vicksburg was preceded by no great victories in the West for either side. The Confederates, however, had been successful in their efforts to hold some points on the Mississippi River, thus preventing its entire control by the Union Army and the complete isolation of the Confederate forces in the Trans-Mississippi Department. On the very day, 4th of July, 1863, when General Grant was receiving the surrender of Vicksburg and its starving army, the Confederates on the other side of the Mississippi were fighting for the possession of the river at Helena, Arkansas. General Sterling Price, Old Pap, as he was affectionately called by his men, who felt for him the devotion of children for a father, had captured one of the leading forts which crowned the hill at Helena, and was halting in the fort for Generals Joe Shelby and Walker under Marmaduke to capture the most northern fort and then sweep down upon the Union lines held by Colonel Clayton. Shelby was wounded, and Walker did not assail the Union lines because he was waiting under orders until the fort was captured by Shelby. Out of this affair grew that unfortunate quarrel between Generals Walker and Marmaduke, which ended in a challenge to a duel, and the killing of Walker by Marmaduke. While Price was thus waiting for the movement under Marmaduke, General Holmes, who was the commander-in-chief of the Confederate forces, rode to the captured fort. He ordered General Price at once to assault an infinitely stronger fort, one heavily manned and practically impregnable. The forces which Price could bring against it were utterly inadequate, and the assault failed, disastrously failed, adding to the discomfiture of the Confederacy. As illustrating the trials which beset both the Confederate and United States governments in their efforts to select able and efficient chiefs for their armies, I may note the fact that the Trans-Mississippi Department changed commanders about as often as the Union Army in Virginia changed leaders in its repeated marches upon Richmond. General Holmes was not successful in his effort to command the support or the goodwill of his officers and men. Disagreements with his officers were not rare, and arrests were not infrequent. On a notable occasion, General Joe Shelby of Missouri, one of the noted cavalry officers of the Civil War, was placed under arrest and ordered to report to the commanding general. Shelby, in his cavalry operations, was compelled to depend largely upon his own efforts among the people to furnish supplies for his men and horses. Necessarily, under such circumstances, there were occasional collisions between his appointed foragers and the suffering citizens. Such disagreements could not be avoided, although the citizens were patriotic and generous, and the large body of Shelby's men were of the law-abiding and leading classes of northern Missouri. When these disagreements occurred between the soldiers and the citizens, complaints were made to General Holmes. Without waiting to investigate the charges, he at once ordered Shelby under arrest. When the dashing cavalryman appeared before his commanding general to learn the reason for his arrest, the irascible General Holmes opened upon him a battery of invective. His first discharge was, "General Shelby, you are charged with being a robber, sir, and your men with being thieves." "Who made these charges, General Holmes?" "Everybody, sir, everybody." "And you believe them, do you, General Holmes?" "Certainly I do, sir. How can I help believing them?" Joe Shelby, justly proud of his splendid command, was deeply indignant at the wrong done both to himself and his high-spirited men. He was also not a little amused by this remarkable procedure and by the fiery invectives of the aged commander. He quietly replied, "Well, General Holmes, I will be more just to you than you have been to me and my men. Everybody says that you are a damned old fool, but I do not believe it." This ended the interview, and in the ensuing battles nothing more was heard of the arrest or the charges. General Shelby died recently while holding the office of United States Marshal for his state and the position of Commander of the United Confederate Veterans of Missouri. Among these Missouri Confederates was Dick Lloyd, a private in Price's command who deserves a place among American heroes. In a furious battle, Dick Lloyd had both arms shot off below the elbow. He recovered, however, and refused to be retired from service. Without hands, he still did his duty as a soldier to the end of the war, acting as courier and guiding and successfully managing his horse by tying the bridle reins around the crook in his elbow. He lives now in Helena and has supported his family for years by riding horseback, carrying mail through country districts. The commander of the Union forces at Helena on this 4th day of July 1863 was the gallant General Prentiss, who made so enviable a record at Shiloh, where he was captured. In that battle, the position which for hours was held by his men was raked by so deadly a fire that it was called by the Federals the Hornet's Nest, and he the hero of the Hornet's Nest. At Helena, July 1863, he repulsed Shelby at the flanking fort, Feagin at Fort Hindman, and Price at Fort Curtis, After that, brave old Missourian had captured the fortress upon Graveyard Hill. Prentiss was, therefore, enabled to join General Grant in celebrating the 4th of July over another victory for the Union armies. The roaring guns on the opposite banks of the Mississippi proclaimed the opening of the river from the source to its mouth. News as depressing to the Confederates as it was inspiring to the Union armies. To the Southern heart and hope, this final capture and complete control of the great waterway, severing the Confederate territory and isolating the great storehouse beyond the Mississippi, while recognized as a great calamity, was perhaps less depressing and galling than the surrender at Vicksburg of Pemberton's splendid army of 35,000 men. The Imperial Roman, Caesar Augustus, after the crushing defeat of his vicegerent Varus in Germany, which involved the destruction of his army and the dragging of his proud eagles in the dust, lamented more the loss of that valiant body of Roman soldiery than he did the breaking of his dominion over German territory. In his grief over this irreparable disaster, Augustus is said to have murmured to himself as he gazed into vacancy, "Varus, Varus, give me back my legions." It is no exaggeration to say that if General Pemberton could have saved his army, could have given back to the Confederacy those splendid legions which had so long and so bravely fought and starved in the trenches around Vicksburg, the fall of that Mississippi city would have been stripped of more than half its depressing effects. General Grant knew this. He knew that the Confederate government could not replace those soldiers, who were among its best, and he decided, therefore, to circumvent, if possible, all efforts at escape and every movement to rescue them. General Johnston, then chief in command of the Army of the West, had anticipated the siege of Vicksburg and had persistently endeavoured to prevent General Pemberton being hemmed in. But there was no other avenue open to General Pemberton, as General Grant had closed all other lines of retreat. The shock of Vicksburg's fall was felt from one end of the Confederacy to the other. Following so closely on the repulse of the Confederates at Gettysburg, it called from the press and people thoughtless and unfair criticisms. In a peculiarly sensitive mood, the public sought some other explanation than the real one, and great injustice was done General Pemberton. But this brave officer's loyalty and devotion were tested, thoroughly tested. At a sacrifice almost measureless, he had separated from his own kindred, and in obedience to his profound convictions had drawn his sword for Southern independence. He did not cut his way out of Vicksburg because his army was not strong enough. He did not hold the city longer because his troops and the population could not live without food. That great soldier, General Joseph E. Johnston, with all his skill in maneuver and as a strategist, failed to afford the needed relief. At Raymond, on May 12th, General Johnston had been forced back upon Jackson, Mississippi. On the 14th, he fought the heavy battle of Jackson. On the 16th, Pemberton moved out and grandly fought, at Champion Hill. 3 days later, he made another stand against Grant's advance at Black River. Holding the weaker lines and with inferior forces, he was driven into the trenches at Vicksburg. On the 22nd of May, 3 days later, General Grant invested the fated city. Thenceforward to July 4th, Pemberton and his men held those works against the combined fire of small arms, artillery and gunboats, sinking a Union monitor on the river, making sorties to the front, resisting efforts to scale the works, rallying around the breach made by the explosion at Fort Hill, rushing upon and crushing the Union columns as they pressed into that breach, and holding the city against every assault, save that of starvation. Scarcely had General Grant settled in his lines around the city when his intrepid men were standing in the dim starlight on the margin of the ditches which bordered the Confederate earthworks. With scaling ladders on their shoulders, they made ready to mount the parapets and fight hand to hand with the devoted Confederate defenders. These great ditches were deep and wide. The scaling ladders were too short. Upon the top of the earthworks stood Pemberton's men, pouring a galling fire down on the Union heads below. Under that fire, the Union ranks melted, some falling dead upon the bank, others tumbling headlong into the ditches, still others leaping voluntarily 16 feet downward to its bottom to escape the consuming blast, and the remainder abandoning the futile effort in precipitate retreat. The commanding position along the line of defensive works was the fortress on the lofty eminence called Fort Hill. Toward this fortress, with the purpose of undermining it and blowing it skyward, General Grant began early in June to drive his zigzag tunnel. The task was not Herculean in the amount of labour required to accomplish it, but was a most tedious one, as but few men could be employed at the work, and every pound of earth had to be carried out at the tunnel's mouth. Day and night the work was pressed. Nearer and nearer the tunnel approached the point where Mother Earth was to receive into her innocent bosom the explosives that would hurl the fort high into the air and bury in the ruins the brave men who defended it. While such explosions failed to accomplish important results during this war, the knowledge that they were to occur, and the uncertainty as to when or where, filled the minds of soldiers with an indescribable apprehension. The high-spirited volunteers of both armies could meet without a tremor the most furious storms and agony of battle in the open field, where they could see the foe and meet fire with fire. If need be, they could face the pelting hail of bullets without returning a shot, and meet death as Napoleon's great marshal proposed to meet it when, in the endeavour to hold his troops in a withering fire without returning it, he stepped to their front and, folding his arms, said to them, "Soldiers of France, see how a marshal can die in discharge of his duty." But to walk the silent parapets in the gloom of night, above the magazine of death which they knew was beneath them, to stand in line along the threatened battlements, with only the dull tread of the sentinel sounding in the darkness, while the imagination pictured the terrors of the explosion which was coming perhaps that night, perhaps that hour or that moment or the next. This was a phase of war which taxed the nerve of any soldier, even the most phlegmatic. Pemberton's soldiers, faint with hunger, and in full knowledge that they were standing above a death-dealing magazine, endured such harrowing suspense night after night for weeks. As each regiment was successively assigned to the awful duty, they wondered whether the tunnel was yet complete, whether the barrels of powder had been placed beneath them, whether it was to be their fate or the fate of the next regiment to be whirled upward with tons of earth and torn limb from limb. Bravely, grandly, they took their posts without a murmur. No hyperbole can exaggerate the loftiness of spirit that could calmly await the moment and manner of such a martyrdom. Every one of those emaciated Southern soldiers who trod that fated ground should have his name recorded in history. Beside them, in American war annals, should be placed the names of those Union soldiers who, amidst the explosions and conflagration at Yorktown, Virginia, in December 1863, won the gratitude of their people. During those trying scenes, in the effort to prevent the escape of the Confederate prisoners, Private Michael Ryan of the 16th New York, his leg shivered by a shell, remained on his knees at his post with his musket in hand. Private Healy, 148th New York, stood at the gate, almost parched by the flames, until the explosion hurled the gate and his own body high into the air. On the night of June 26, 1863, the long-dreaded hour came to Pemberton's faithful and fated watchers. General Grant had finished his tunnel. Under the fortress at Fort Hill he had piled the tons of powder, and had run through this powder electric wires whose sparks of fire were to wake the Black Hercules to the work of death. As Pemberton's Confederates stood around the silent battlements, the moments were lengthened into hours by the intensity of their apprehension, and as Grant's veterans crept and formed in the darkness behind the adjacent hills, waiting for the earthquake shock to summon them to the breach, the clock in the sleeping city struck the hour of 10. The electric messengers flew along the wires. The loaded magazines responded with the convulsive roar of 1,000 unchained thunderbolts. The hills quivered, shaking from roof to foundation stone every Vicksburg home. High above its highest turret flew the trampled floor of the fortress, with the bodies of its grey-clad defenders. Into its powder-blackened and smoking ruins quickly rushed the charging columns of Grant, led by the 32nd Regiment of Illinois. Pemberton's Confederates from the right and left and rear of the demolished fort piled into the breach at the same instant. Hand to hand over the upheaved and rugged earth they grappled with the invaders in the darkness. This Illinois regiment, after desperately fighting and holding the breach for 2 hours, was overpowered. Again and again, in rapid succession, came the Union charges. Pemberton's veterans, from the broken rim of the fortress, poured upon them an incessant fire from small arms, and, carrying loaded shells with burning fuses in their hands, rolled them down the crater's banks to explode among the densely packed attacking forces. For 6 hours this furious combat raged in the darkness. From 10 at night till 4 in the morning, the resolute Federals held the breach, but could make no headway against the determined Confederate resistance. The tunnel had been driven, the magazine exploded, and the fort demolished. The long agony of Confederate suspense was over. The desperate effort of the Union commander to force his column through the breach had failed. The heaps of his dead and wounded, more than 1,000 in number, pilled in that narrow space, had given to this spot among his surviving men the name of Logan's Slaughter Pen. In the terrific explosion, a Confederate Negro, who chanced to be in the fort at the time, was thrown a considerable distance toward the Union line without being fatally hurt. Picking himself up half dead, half alive, he found around him the Union soldiers moving on the smoking crater. "How did you get here?" he was asked. "Don't know, boss. Yesterday I was in the Confederacy, but bless the Lord, last night something busted and bioed me plumb into the Union." Chapter 13. From Vicksburg and Gettysburg to Chickamauga. In the autumn of 1863, both Lee's and Meade's armies had returned from Pennsylvania and were again camping or tramping on the soil of Virginia. The Union forces were in complete and easy communication with the great storehouses and granaries of the North and West. The Confederates were already in a struggle for meagre subsistence. Meade began another march on Richmond. Lee patched up his army as best he could, threw it across Meade's path, and halted him at the Rapidan. Thenceforward, for weeks and months, these two commanders were watching each other from opposite sides of the Rapidan, moving up and down the river and the roads, seeking an opportunity for a blow and never finding it. Lee made the first move. On October 9, 1863, he headed his army again toward Washington and the Potomac, passing Meade's right and threatening to throw the Confederates between the Union forces and the national capital. Lee at one time was nearer to Washington than Meade, but as there was no longer any green corn in the fields for the Southern soldiers to subsist upon, the difficulty of feeding them checked Lee's march and put Meade ahead of him and nearer to the defences around Washington. Lee then debated whether he should assail Meade on or near the old field of Bull Run or recross the Potomac into Maryland and Pennsylvania. He decided not to attack because he found Meade's position too strong and too well entrenched. He declined to cross again the Potomac at the opening of winter because, as he said, "Thousands of our men are barefooted, thousands with fragments of shoes, all without overcoats, blankets, or warm clothing. I cannot bear to expose them to certain suffering on an uncertain issue." We were not able then, as formerly, to furnish to each soldier strips of rawhide, which he might tie on, with the hair side next his feet, and thus make rude sandals. And these picturesque foot coverings, if obtainable, would scarcely have been sufficient for long marches in the coming freezes. So Lee returned to his camps behind the Rapidan and Rappahannock. Some spirited engagements of minor importance occurred between detached portions of the two armies, in which the honours were about equally divided between the two sides. Stuart's Southern horsemen had the better of the fight at Buckland, and the Confederates were successful on the Rapidan. But Warren's Union forces captured 5 pieces of artillery and between 400 and 500 prisoners from A.P. Hill. As Lee moved back, Meade followed, and the programme of marching after each other across the river was resumed. Just 1 month, lacking 2 days, after Lee's move toward Washington, Meade turned his columns toward Richmond. His first dash, made at a redoubt which stood in his way on the north bank of the Rappahannock, was a brilliant success. The redoubt was occupied by a portion of Early's troops and was carried just before nightfall by a sudden rush. I sat on my horse with a number of officers on the opposite side of the little river, almost within a stone's throw of the spot. General Early did not seem to consider it seriously threatened, nor did anyone else, although the Union artillery was throwing some shells, one of which lowered the perch of a visiting civilian at my side by shortening the legs of his horse. The dash upon the redoubt was made by Maine and Wisconsin regiments' troops of Russell and Upton, under Sedgwick, who was regarded by the Confederates as one of the best officers in the Union Army. Personally, I had great reason to respect Sedgwick, for it was my fortune in the ensuing campaign to be pitted against him on several occasions. Though nothing like so serious to the Confederates in its results, this brilliant little episode on the Rappahannock resembled in character the subsequent great charge of Hancock over the Bloody Angle at Spotsylvania on May 12, 1864. Both assaults were so unexpected and made with such a rush that the defending troops had no time to fire. Only a few shots were discharged at Hancock's men at Spotsylvania, and in the capture of this redoubt by Russell and Upton, only 6 Union men were killed. It was justly considered by General Meade as most creditable to his troops, and he sent General Russell himself to bear the 8 captured Confederate flags to Washington. Mr. Stanton may have been a great Secretary of War, and I must suppose him such, but if he treated General Russell as he is reported to have treated him, he had as little appreciation of the keen sensibilities of a high-strung soldier as old Boreas has for the green summer glories of the great oak. The Secretary, it is said, was too busy to see General Russell. The proposition will scarcely be questioned, I think, that a Secretary of War, who is not called upon to endure the hardships of the field and meet the dangers of battle, should never be too busy to meet a gallant soldier who is defending his flag at the front, and who calls to lay before him the trophies of victory. Perhaps the Secretary thought that General Russell and his men had only done their duty. So they had. But Light Horse Harry Lee, the father of General Robert E. Lee, only did his duty when he planned and executed the brilliant dash upon Paulus Hook and captured it. The Continental Congress, however, thought it worth its while to turn from its regular business and make recognition of the handsome work done by voting the young officer a gold medal. All the wreaths ever conferred at the Olympic Games, all the decorations of honour ever bestowed upon the brave, all the swords and the thanks ever voted to a soldier, were designed to make the same impress upon their recipients, which 3 minutes of the busy Secretary's time and a few gracious words would have produced on the mind and spirit of General Russell and his comrades. General Meade crossed the Rappahannock and then recrossed it. He found Lee strongly posted behind Mine Run and suddenly returned to his winter quarters. General Lee moved back to his encampment on the border of the wilderness and along the historic banks of the Rapidan. Meantime, in the months intervening between the Gettysburg campaign and the hibernation of the two armies in 1863-64, a portion of Lee's forces had been sent under Longstreet to aid Bragg in his effort to check the further advance of the Union Army under Rosecrans at Chickamauga. My troops were not among those sent to Georgia, and therefore took no part in that great battle which saturated with blood the soil of my native state. A chapter full of interest to the military critic and to the student of strategy might be written of the two armies commanded respectively by Rosecrans and Bragg, and of their movements prior to the clash in the woodlands at Chickamauga. The antecedent campaign runs back in a connected chain to the Battle of Murfreesboro, Tennessee, in the preceding December. Under General Bragg at Murfreesboro, as one of his division commanders, was an ex-Vice President of the United States, who had also been a prominent candidate for the presidency in the campaign of 1860, and had presided over the joint session of the two houses of Congress, when Abraham Lincoln was declared duly elected. This illustrious statesman, who was fast winning his way to distinction in his new role of Confederate soldier, was John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky. Tall, erect, and commanding in physique, he would have been selected in any martial group as a typical leader. In the campaign in the Valley of Virginia, where I afterwards saw much of him, he exhibited in a marked degree the characteristics of a great commander. He was fertile in resource, and enlisted and held the confidence and affection of his men, while he inspired them with enthusiasm and ardour. Under fire and in extreme peril, he was strikingly courageous, alert, and self-poised. No man in the Confederate Army had surrendered a brighter political future, sacrificed more completely his personal ambition, or suffered more keenly from the perplexing conditions in his own state. With all his other trials, and before he had fairly begun his career as a soldier, General Breckinridge had been strongly tempted to challenge to personal combat his superior officer, General Bragg, who at the time was Commander-in-Chief of the Confederate forces in the Department of Tennessee and the West. At the Battle of Murfreesboro, Tennessee, December 1862, this brilliant soldier from the Bluegrass region had led his gallant Kentuckians through a consuming fire on both flanks, losing about 36% of his men in less than half an hour. General Bragg, who, it seems, was not present at the point where this movement was made, had in some way been misinformed as to the conduct of General Breckinridge's troops, and sent to Richmond a disparaging dispatch. These high-bred sons of Kentucky, who had left home and kindred behind them, had already made a record of devotion and daring, which grew in lustre to the end of the war, and which any troops of any army might envy. At this Battle of Murfreesboro, they had waded the river in chilly December, had charged and captured the first heights and doubled back one wing of their stubbornly fighting antagonists. They had, however, been repelled with terrific slaughter in the impossible effort to capture the still more commanding hill. In this fearful assault, they had marched between converging lines of fire drawn up in the shape of the letter Y, the apex of those lines formed by hills crowned with batteries. Among their killed was the dashing General Hanson, one of the foremost soldiers of Bragg's army. No troops that were ever marshalled could have succeeded under such conditions and against such odds. Had they persisted in the effort, they would simply have invited annihilation. Smarting under a sense of the injustice done themselves and their dead comrades by the commanding general's dispatch to Richmond, and realizing their own inability to have the wrong righted, they appealed to General Breckinridge, their own commander, to resent the insult. Resolutions and protests were powerless to soothe their smarting sensibilities or to assuage their burning wrath. They urged General Breckinridge to resign his position in the army and call General Bragg to personal account to challenge him to single-handed combat. General Breckinridge must have felt as keenly as they the wrong inflicted, but he was more self-contained. He sought to appease them by reminding them of the exalted motives which had impelled them to enlist in the army as volunteers, of the self-sacrifice which they had exhibited, and of their duty as soldiers to endure any personal wrong for the sake of the common cause. His appeal was not in vain, and when he added that if both he and General Bragg should live to the end of the war, he would not forget their request to call the commanding general to account, they gladly went forward, enduring and fighting to the end. The Fabian policy of General Bragg, adopted after the bloody encounter at Murfreesboro, his retreat to Chattanooga and beyond it, called from press and people fewer and milder protests than those afterward made against General Joseph E. Johnston for a like policy. It would seem that the persistent criticisms of General Johnston for not meeting General Sherman between Dalton and Atlanta in determined battle might have been applied with equal force to General Bragg for surrendering the strong positions in the gaps of the Cumberland Mountains and the line of the Tennessee River to General Rosecrans, without more resolute resistance. It is much easier, however, to criticize a commander than to command an army. In both these cases, the strong positions alluded to could have been successfully flanked, and the Confederate commanders forced to retire, as the Union troops moved around toward the rear and threatened the southern lines of communication and supplies. General Rosecrans was too able a soldier and too wise a strategist to assail General Bragg in his selected stronghold when the country was open to him on either flank. His policy, therefore, was to cross the Tennessee River, not in front of Chattanooga, where Bragg was ready to meet him, but at a distance either above or below it. Both were practicable, and he set his army in motion toward points both above and below the city, thus leaving General Bragg in doubt as to his real purpose. He sent a force to the hills just opposite Chattanooga, and opened heavy fire with his batteries upon Bragg's position. He sent still larger forces up the right bank of the Tennessee to a point more than 40 miles above Chattanooga. Campfires were built along the brows of the mountains and on hillsides, in order to attract Bragg's attention and create the belief that the great body of the Union Army was above the city. Troops were marched across open spaces exposed to view, then countermarched behind the hills, and passed again and again through the same open spaces, thus deepening the impression that large forces were marching up the river. To still further strengthen this impression upon the Confederate commander, Union drums were beat and bugles sounded for great distances along the mountain ranges. Union axes, saws, and hammers were loud in their demonstrations of boat building, but they were only demonstrations. The real work, the real preparation, was going forward fully 50 miles south of this noisy point. The apparent movement above Chattanooga and the real preparation for crossing far below were admirably planned and consummately executed by General Rosecrans, and showed a strategic ability perhaps not surpassed by any officer during the war. Behind the woods and hills, men were drilled in the work of laying bridges. Trains of cars loaded with bridges and boats were unloaded at a point entirely protected from the view of the Confederate cavalry on the opposite banks of the river. 50 of these boats, each with a capacity of 50 men, were hurried in the early morning to the riverbank and launched upon the water. This formidable fleet, carrying 2,500 armed men, pulled for the other shore, which was guarded only by Confederate cavalry pickets. With this strong force of Union infantry landed on the southern bank, the pontoon bridge soon spanned the stream. Across it were hurried all the Union infantry and artillery that could be crowded upon it. At other points, canoes of enormous size were hewn out of tall poplars that grew in the lowlands. Logs were rolled into the stream and fastened together, and as these improvised flotillas, loaded with soldiers, were pushed from the shore, athletic swimmers, left behind, caught the enthusiasm, and piling their clothing, arms, and accoutrements upon rails lashed together, leaped into the stream and swam across, pushing the loaded rails before them. At still another point, the Union cavalry rode into the river and spurred their hesitating horses into the deep water for a long swim to the other shore. As thousands of struggling, snorting horses bore these human forms sitting upright upon their backs, nothing seen above the water's surface except the erect upper portions of the riders' bodies and the puffing nostrils of the horses with their bushy tails spread out behind them, the scene must have presented the appearance of a mass of moving centaurs rather than an army of mounted soldiers. Such scenes, however, were not infrequent during the war, especially with the noted Confederate raiders of John Morgan, Jeb Stuart, Bedford Forrest, and Mosby. With his army safely across the river, General Rosecrans pushed heavy columns across Raccoon and Lookout Mountains and the intervening valley, completely turned General Bragg's position, and compelled the evacuation of Chattanooga without a skirmish. It would be the grossest injustice to General Bragg to hold him responsible for the failure to prevent General Rosecrans crossing the Tennessee. An army double the size of the one he commanded would have been wholly insufficient to cover the stretch of more than 100 miles of river frontage. The Union commander could have laid his pontoons and forced a passage at almost any point against so attenuated a line of resistance. General Bragg was not only one of the boldest fighters in the Confederate Army, but he was an able commander. Retreat from Chattanooga was his only resource. This movement was made not an hour too soon. Rosecrans's columns were sweeping down from the eastern lookout bluffs, and would speedily have grasped Bragg's only line of railroad and held his only avenues of escape. As the Union officers Thomas and McCook came down the eastern slopes of the mountain, and Crittenden came around its point and into Chattanooga, Bragg placed his army in position for either resisting, retreating, or advancing. He decided to assume the offensive and to attack the Union forces in their isolated positions, and crush them, if possible, in detail. Longstreet had not yet arrived, but had Bragg's plan of assault been vigorously executed, it now seems certain that he would have won a great triumph before the Union army could have been concentrated along the western bank of the Chickamauga. General Rosecrans himself and his corps commanders were fully alive to the hazardous position of his army. Bragg's aggressive front changed the policy of the Union commander from one of segregation for pursuit to one of concentration for defense. Rapidly and skillfully was that concentration effected. Boldly and promptly did the Confederates advance. The next scene on which the curtain rose was the collision, the crash, the slaughter at Chickamauga. Chapter 14. Chickamauga. Reared from childhood to maturity in North Georgia, I have been for 50 years familiar with that historic locality traversed by the little river Chickamauga, which has given its name to one of the bloodiest battles of modern times. Not many years after the Cherokee Indians had been transferred to their new western home from what was known as Cherokee, Georgia, my father removed to that portion of the state. Here were still the fresh relics of the redskin warriors who had fished in Chickamauga's waters and shot the deer as they browsed in herds along its banks. Every locality now made memorable by that stupendous struggle between the Confederate and Union armies was impressed upon my boyish memory by the legends which associated them with deeds of Indian braves. One of the most prominent features of the field was the old Ross House, built of hewn logs and formerly the home of Ross, a noted and fairly well-educated Cherokee chief. In this old building I had often slept at night on my youthful journeyings with my father through that sparsely settled region. Snodgrass Hill, Gordon's and Lee's Mills, around which the battle raged, the Lafayette Road, across which the contending lines so often swayed, and the Crystal Crawfish Spring, at which were gathered thousands of the wounded, have all been so long familiar to me that I am encouraged to attempt a brief description of the awful and inspiring events of those bloody September days in 1863. Words, however, cannot convey an adequate picture of such scenes, of the countless costly daring assaults, of the disciplined or undisciplined but always dauntless courage, of the grim, deadly grapple in hand-to-hand collisions, of the almost unparalleled slaughter and agony. An American battle which surpassed in its ratio of carnage the bloodiest conflicts in history outside of this country ought to be better understood by the American people. Sharpsburg, or Antietam, I believe, had a larger proportion of killed and wounded than any other single day's battle of our war, and that means larger than any in the world's wars. Chickamauga, however, in its 2 days of heavy fighting, brought the ratio of losses to the high water mark. Judged by percentage in killed and wounded, Chickamauga nearly doubled the sanguinary records of Marengo and Austerlitz, was 2.5 times heavier than that sustained by the Duke of Marlborough at Malplaquet, more than double that suffered by the army under Henry of Navarre in the terrific slaughter at Coutras, nearly 3 times as heavy as the percentage of loss at Solferino and Magenta, 5 times greater than that of Napoleon at Wagram, and about 10 times as heavy as that of Marshal Saxe at Bloody Roku. Or if we take the average percentage of loss in a number of the world's great battles, Waterloo, Wagram, Yalmy, Magenta, Solferino, Zurich and Lodi, we shall find by comparison that Chickamauga's record of blood surpassed them nearly 3 for 1. It will not do to say that this horrible slaughter in our Civil War was due to the longer range of our rifles, nor to the more destructive character of any of our implements of warfare. For at Chickamauga, as well as in the Wilderness and at Shiloh, where these Americans fell at so fearful a rate, the woodlands prevented the hostile lines from seeing each other at great distances, and rendered the improved arms no more effective than would have been rifles of short range. Some other and more reasonable explanation must be found for this great disparity of losses in American and European wars. There is but one possible explanation: the personal character and the consecrated courage of American soldiers. At Chickamauga, thousands fell on both sides, fighting at close quarters, their faces at times burnt by the blazing powder at the very muzzles of the guns. The Federal Army under Rosecrans constituted the center of the Union battle line, which, in broadest military sense, stretched from Washington City to New Orleans. The fall of Vicksburg had at last established federal control of the Mississippi along its entire length. The purpose of Rosecrans's movement was to penetrate the South's center by driving the Confederates through Georgia to the sea. Bragg, to whom was entrusted for the time the task of resisting this movement, had retired before the Union advance from Chattanooga to a point some miles south of the Chickamauga, and the Union forces were pressing closely upon his rear. Bragg had, however, halted and turned upon Rosecrans and compelled him to retrace his steps to the north bank of the Chickamauga, which, like the Chickahominy in Virginia, was to become forever memorable in the Republic's annals. In order to obtain a clear and comprehensive view of the ever-shifting scenes during the prolonged battle, to secure a mental survey of the whole field as the marshalled forces swayed to and fro, charging and countercharging, assaulting, breaking, retreating, reforming, and again rushing forward in still more desperate assault. Let the reader imagine himself on some great elevation from which he could look down upon that wooded, undulating, and rugged region. For 48 hours or more, the marching columns of Bragg were moving toward Chattanooga and along the south bank of the Chickamauga in order to cross the river and strike the Union forces on the left flank. At the same time, Rosecrans summoned his corps from different directions and concentrated them north of the river. Having passed, as was supposed, far below the point where the Union left rested, Bragg's columns, in the early hours of the 19th of September, crossed the fords and bridges and prepared to sweep by left wheel on the Union flank. During the night, however, George H. Thomas had moved his Union corps from the right to this left flank. Neither army knew of the presence of the other in this portion of the woodland. As Bragg prepared to assail the Union left, Thomas, feeling his way through the woods to ascertain what was in his front, unexpectedly struck the southern right, held by Forrest's cavalry, and thus inaugurated the battle. Forrest was forced back, but he quickly dismounted his men, sent the horses to the rear, and on foot stubbornly resisted the advance of the Union infantry. Quickly the Confederates moved to Forrest's support. The roar of small arms on this extreme flank in the early morning admonished both commanders to hurry thither their forces. Bragg was forced to check his proposed assault upon another portion of the Union lines and move to the defense of the Confederate right. Rapidly the forces of the two sides were thrown into this unexpected collision, and rapidly swelled the surging current of battle. The divisions of the Union army before whom Forrest's cavalry had yielded were now driven back, but other Federals suddenly rushed upon Forrest's front. The Southern troops, under Cheatham and Stewart, Polk, Buckner, and Cleburne, hurried forward in a united assault upon Thomas. Walthal's Mississippians at this moment were hurled upon King's flank and drove his brigade in confusion through the Union lines. Simultaneously, Govan's grey-clad veterans assailed the Union forces under Scribner, leading to their yielding. The Federal battery was captured, and momentarily the tide of success seemed to favour the Confederates. However, fortune, always fickle, was especially capricious in this battle. The Union forces farther to the westward held their ground with desperate tenacity. General Rosecrans, the Federal commander-in-chief, rode amidst his troops as they hurried in converging columns to the point of heaviest fire, and in person hurled them fiercely against the steadfast Confederate front. The shouts, yells, and the roll of musketry swelled the din of battle to a deafening roar. The fighting was terrific. Walthal's Mississippians at this point contended desperately with attacks in front and on their flank. The 9th Ohio, at double quick and with a mighty shout, rushed upon the captured Union battery and recovered it. The Confederate gunners bravely stood at their posts and were killed by bayonets. Hour after hour the battle raged, extending its fire area and the volume of its tremendous roar. Here and there along the lines, a shattered command, its leading officers dead or wounded, was withdrawn, reorganized, and quickly returned to its bloody work. Still farther toward the Confederate right, Forrest again essayed to turn the Union left. Charging as infantry, he pressed forward through a tempest of shot and neared the Union flank. Federal batteries poured upon his entire line rapid discharges of grape, canister, and shell. Round after round, on flank and front, these deadly volleys came until Forrest's dissolving lines disappeared, leaving heaps of dead near the mouths of the Union guns. Reforming his broken ranks, Forrest, with Cheatham's support, again rushed upon the Union left. The impetuous onset brought portions of the hostile lines to a hand-to-hand struggle. Still, there was no decisive break in the stubborn Union ranks. Coming through woods and fields from the other wings, the flapping ensigns marked the rapid concentration of both armies around this vortex of battle. As the converging columns met, bayonet clashed with bayonet, and the trampled earth was saturated with blood. Here and there, the Union line was broken by the charges of Cheatham, Stewart, and Johnson, but it was quickly reformed and re-established by the troops under Reynolds. The Union commands of Carlin and Hegg were swept back before the fire at short range from the Southern muskets, but as the Confederate lines again advanced and leaped into the Union trenches, they were met and checked by a headlong countercharge. The Lafayette Road, along or near which the broken lines of each army were rallied and reformed, and across which the surging currents of fire had repeatedly rolled, became the bloody lane of Chickamauga. The remorseless war god at this hour relaxed his hold on the two armies, whose lifeblood had been flowing since early morning. Gradually the mighty wrestlers grew weary and faint, and silence reigned again in the shell-shivered forest. It was, however, only a lull in the storm. On the extreme Union left, the restless Confederates were again moving into line for a last and tremendous effort. The curtain of night slowly descended, and the powder-blackened bayonets and flags over the hostile lines were but dimly seen in the dusky twilight. Wearily, the battered ranks in grey moved again through the bullet-scarred woods, over the dead bodies of their brothers who fell in the early hours, and whose pale faces told the living of coming fate. Nature mercifully refused to lend her light to guide the unyielding armies to further slaughter. But the blazing muzzles of the rifles now became their guides, and the first hour of darkness was made hideous by resounding small arms and their lurid flashes. Such was the night between the battles of the 19th and 20th of September at Chickamauga. At 9 o'clock on that Sabbath morning, as the church bells of Chattanooga summoned its children to Sunday school, the signal guns sounding through the forests at Chickamauga called the bleeding armies again to battle. The troops of Longstreet had arrived, and he was assigned to the command of the Confederate left, with D.H. Hill commanding the Confederate right. On this latter wing of Bragg's army were the troops of John C. Breckinridge, W.H.T. Walker, Patrick Cleburne, and A.P. Stewart, with Cheatham in reserve. Confronting them and forming the Union left were the blue-clad veterans under Baird, Johnson, Palmer, and Reynolds, with Gordon Granger in reserve.